Black Cats Run podcast. I'm Tristan Black Ingersoll, and this is Black Cats Run. On today's episode, Seeing is Believing. We are going to explore the evidence in favor of training at what I believe is the correct lactate threshold. Frame that in the context of the fact that there really maybe aren't any zones at all. Is this a conspiracy theory? Is this secretly a flat earther, truther movement in disguise? Let's find out. Let's get into today's episode. I'm Tristan Black Ingersoll, and this is Black Cats Run. On today's episode, Seeing is Believing, what I want to talk about and explore with you is this concept that I'm calling the Aerobic Calculator. I think that oftentimes it's hard to see that our training is working, and we're left to sort of believe in the symbolic power of the supposedly transformative quality of the training that we're applying, even though we won't necessarily know. And really, when you look at the way practice in training and coaching has developed over time, we apparently aren't even supposed to be able to know until we get to the race. My suggestion is something different. I think that if you train at the right intensity, you should be able to clearly model improvement and how you can do this, and then use that knowledge to train in a responsive way where you can see what's happening as you go and make adjustments and get more out of your training, find the time you invest more worthwhile, more rewarding, get better race results without having to wait for the race to sort of test the hypothesis, right? That is any given training model that functions as a hypothesis. That is the scope of this episode. So today's episode, Seeing is Believing. How can we learn to perceive the development in our training, and how and what approaches to intensity are going to make that possible? I think that most of us get into athletics and sustain an interest, especially in individual endurance sports, because there's something sort of romanticized and exciting and adventurous about pursuing these kinds of goals. And that sense of becoming something more than we are, I think, is driving. It is an addictive, that sense of developing mastery. But, we don't want to end up tilting at windmills, and, a lot of us, unfortunately, find our way to that point eventually. And it's not always an easy process. Sometimes it's like climbing a mountain where you're sort of struggling to feel like you're making any progress despite all of the suffering that you are enduring. And when you reach that next horizon on that ascent, it can sort of make it all worthwhile. But there's also that sense of, where is the summit? How far should I be able to go? Am I heading in the right direction? Do I have the right equipment, the right possibilities to empower myself in that process? And, again, right, when we can't have that experience and that outcome, it becomes very frustrating very quickly. And the scale of intensity as we look at this stuff is one of the problems, right? How hard do we really need to be going, right? We can be working to the point of exhaustion. Some people will push themselves to the point of throwing up. I think in swimming culture in particular is where I still hear a lot of stories about puking as being a benchmark, and including in youth swimming programs, that barfing is somehow a sign that you're pushing yourself. I don't believe that is correct. I think that should obviously be a physiological indicator of distress. I mean, I think you can go to the point of absolute failure beyond that, where your entire body just is on fire and everything is like, you're burning the house down. But if you believe strongly enough that your methodology, your approach, that if you believe in the power of the system of symbols that really is any given training plan or set of training ideas, we will persevere through that. The point where sometimes we feel like we're literally killing ourselves and we're not making any progress. We're just not really getting anywhere. And that can be, overwhelming and demoralizing. And I think some people will just continue to sustain to that point. And then some of us dispositionally might continue to just sort of engage in this pattern. And I think other people get burnt out. And athletic culture sort of encourages us to perceive that experience of burnout and loss of interest as some sort of sign of personal failure, some sort of evidence of an inability to have what it takes. And, I think the internet and social media has really helped to show the extent to which people do regard athletics as this process by which we overcome absolute impossibility through a sheer act of will, and the extent to which we're teaching and reinforcing that notion, and probably maybe extending that and popularizing that more than we should. But if we think about how hard we train, I think these sort of ideas of heroic endeavor and sort of epic showdown with the given workout or the training session, I think is moving ourselves in the wrong direction, even if it is been well established as kind of the traditional approach to this sort of stuff. So I think if we look at this in a simpler, more essential sort of way, what is the basic concept of the scale of exertion? Well, I think at the predominant starting point is endurance, right? Increasing your ability to tolerate some minimum level of work, the ability to cover a given amount of distance, the ability to maintain a pattern of movement. Nordic skiing, swimming, cycling, running, race walking. I mean, the list of endurance sports is quite long. And all of these, have this characteristic in common, right? How long can I maintain this unique pattern of physicality, physical movement that is this sport? And then the next layer to this, of course, becomes speed, right? And that we progress then to the ability of, well, how fast can I get over these distances? And I think this simple logic of it's endurance, but ultimately you're trying to perform faster leads to this training model of an endurance speed paradigm. And, that becomes sort of the arrow of progress over time, when the drill bit by which we sort of engage and move deeper into that possibility, right? This is how we're continuing to climb and make the ascent up that metaphorical mountain. But, the other things that's true here is when we look at this sort of structure of endurance and speed, I think we also find that a gross minority of the population is the sort of demographic, the ruling class of this paradigm. They're sort of king of the hill. And I think, and this is a subjective evaluation on my part, it could be true, it might not be true, but it seems like it's maybe at best 10% of the population seems to really thrive when the training paradigms that are, popular and accepted practice today are applied. And I think even among that population, and this is why, even though the 10% is an evaluation that I'm sort of conjuring up and applying here, I think that even among that percentage of the population, I think there's a lot of, conflicted feeling there. And I've talked about in other episodes on the podcast that one area where I see this is narrative of burnout and loss of interest in cyclists. And you see this on, American publication, Velo News all the time. Everybody quitting, hating cycling. And I can't fathom that, but I think I've come to believe more and more that it's this sense of impossibility with the expectations of training. And even if it's quote unquote working for them, either in the sense that they're experiencing progress or just in the sense that even if you apply a ineffectual training program to everybody, there's going to be a resultant hierarchy of performance. Just like if you take elementary school students and you have them run a 1 mile run in physical education, and these kids are not doing any sort of real exercise routine or program, there's going to be a hierarchy. They're not all going to run in synchronization and finish at the same time. And, for 90% of us, though, I think that it's more pronounced because we're not really climbing into that point of ascendancy. And I think an interesting parallel that sort of is informing my 10%, 90% is, I think in the United States every year, it's about 250,000 public school students will run cross country every fall. And of that group, maybe about 7% of them will go on and try to keep running for 4 more years in college. And obviously there's other factors at play, but I think that even among that population, that 7%, I think there's a strong sense of frustration and sense of like, I'm not attaining what I feel like I should be able to do, but is it sort of an expression or an articulation of, ego almost to see this to be the case? But these people at the top, that sort of becomes the group that we really stare at and focus on and obsess over. And, culturally, we've labeled these people as, the elite. And, how they get to the point of being elite, what are their practices, what are their methods, I think, is complicated. And I think the perception, again, is that, they're either driving themselves to exhaustion, they're puking, they're immolating themselves. And, you'll see now, thanks to YouTube and stuff, in some instances, people just, basically, going out there and, in the metaphor of the endurance sports vernacular, just dying, out there in these sessions. And it really creates the notion that it's the capacity to not just like resist, the intense nature of exercise, but to like internally generate that kind of intensity. And I think for some people, the sense is like, well, I can't even train that hard in the first place. And, those narratives of exertion are really popular and really compelling. And, I certainly feel that this has been largely true of my experience with trying to do this stuff for, most of my, I started doing, I would say when I was 10. And when I was 10 years old is when I joined a swim team. And, from that point to now, so it's been about 24 years, I've been continuously engaged in this stuff, and to different extents and different disciplines. And, I would say overall, I've been, largely disappointed. I think, I've enjoyed the activities enough to not give up and want to stop doing them. But from a performance perspective, I've been largely disappointed. And, there have been a lot of years, since I left doing interscholastic athletics where you have a competition schedule and you basically have to do it, that, I've really had no interest in competing because I've, been disillusioned with the experience. And so, one of those problems is when you have an alienation of labor, which you can experience alienation of labor within the context of your own training. When you're putting in a lot of work and you're not seeing any results develop from that, that can be very difficult. That can be very frustrating. And so one of the exercises I did the other day, thought exercise, is I was looking at some data and from some adjustments I had made to my running, going back to the beginning of July, and I've shared this on other episodes, and I've posted some of this data on our Instagram page at Black Cats Run. You're welcome to check that out if you would like to. But one of the findings I had is I went back in, I think it was October 5th. I had agreed to do the Marine Corps marathon, per the request of a friend of mine who was from the area. And, I was sort of ambiguous about it. I figured, why not? I don't identify as a marathoner per se, but I do identify as an endurance athlete. And my feeling is if it's an endurance event, I basically can do it. And maybe I'm not going to always do it up to my level of proficiency, but I've kind of changed my mindset a little bit to, if I always have this idea of I can't race unless I've figured it out and I'm in awesome fitness, the reality is life is just going to keep passing you by and you're going to never go out and do that. So I've sort of tried to, work with a more open mind about, what, I'm going to go out and do races and events if I feel like doing it, and I'm not really going to worry about what my level of performance is. And that doesn't mean I'm not going to try to prepare, but if I'm like, well, I haven't executed the perfect imaginary marathon block, then I'm not going to do it. And so this is some data that stretches over a 278-day period from October 5th, which is like a month out from the Marine Corps Marathon, all the way through to the end of June of this year. So October 5th of 22 to the end of June of 23. And these are all of the workouts that I did through that time. Each of these points is a workout, and it's the average speed for the workout. And this is what I accomplished. And when I worked through this process, what did we see? Right? Well, when we look at the data, that I actually experienced generally a trend towards regression. And, to the extent that there's really much of a trend at all, like there really isn't even a trend. And now the whole point, and that doesn't, invalidate the fact there's a regression. The whole point of training is to progress. And to the extent that there's a clear trend, it's a trend of getting slower. And you can see how widely dispersed, the data points are. And, by the standard of this graph, I more or less regressed from working out at 6:55 to 7-minute pace to, being able to work out at 7:15 pace. And I would also point out that another concept of this is, in theory, if I wanted to go out and do all of these as hard as I could, I would do that. But this represented me trying to back off and adjust my intensity. Because I think a lot of us take a look at lactate threshold stuff and we say, okay, the key thing here is to go a little bit easier. And so this is me trying to go easier and trying to follow more of that, lactate threshold trend. And I would say that, if you've listened to other episodes on the pod, you would already know this. So bear with me as I repeat this, but I would say I'm basically a reformed or recovered kind of, when you want to kind of call it FTP or 60-minute, power person. Whereas I used to subscribe to that as an interpretation of aerobic capacity and aerobic fitness. And I've now really recognized that this is not the case. And, what I want to be showing you here today is that, this is not really a valid approach, training at this higher level intensity. And I believe that the issue is that we need to pull back more. And I want to show you how by training slower than I literally ever have in running, going back to when I was in 8th grade, when I was 13 years old, and I first started running competitively, I have never trained this slow, ever. And I'm not talking about the 278-day graph. I'm talking about what I have done since July over the last 9 or so weeks. And, I think for me, a lot of times the mindset was the more that I go out and crush myself, the better that I'm going to be. And I've, tried to think more dynamically now about what the scale of exertion is, and that what's the true scale of exertion? How hard is it really supposed to be? Well, I think the range, if we're being objective, has to be somewhere between lying down and just sort of talking or thinking about training and hoping that the idea of free associating about the possibility of training will make us better, to absolutely destroying ourselves as much as possible to the nth degree. And, rationally, then it has to be somewhere not at one of those extremes. And I think what's interesting is the totally destroying yourself concept should be just as much of an extreme to people as is the notion of lying on the couch and thinking that just thinking exercise thoughts will improve your fitness and your performance. But I think if you really were to try to, in some way, survey people and have them sort of scale that on a scale of 1 to 100, 1 being lying on the couch, 100 being setting yourself on fire and running on a treadmill, I think people would probably scale closer towards the treadmill than the couch, which is ironic because actually lying on the couch is probably better for performance. Like you'd probably be better off doing nothing than working to absolute physical failure, because if you work to absolute physical failure, your capacity to go out and do work is actually going to be more limited than if you do nothing, because you will have created a level of fatigue that will limit what your muscles could do if they're totally rested, will limit what your body could do if you're rested. And if your muscles are fatigued, then you are limiting that concept of speed. And, if we think back to that idea of endurance speed, right? The notion is that you need speed to improve your endurance. And my suggestion is that actually the issue is that we have the speed. And this isn't necessarily an original observation, though I think anybody can recognize this as a logical conclusion. But to give a historical context to this, there's an interview on YouTube with Arthur Lydiard towards the end of his life. And they're asking about, well, how did you develop these ideas? And what was your inspiration? And he said that he read a book about training that was written in the 1930s. And he was reading this, I think, in like the 40s or the 50s. And, he said there weren't a lot of books about training then. People weren't really writing much. And I would say today there still aren't very many books about training that are worth reading or are saying anything original or thought-provoking. But he said that he looks at this stuff, and what he's recognized in reading this author is the author suggested that there are plenty of quarter milers who could run the quarter mile in close to 45 seconds. I don't know what the world record was at the time the book was published, but it was norm, right? And you see that today, right? You have high school kids, you get a small population size. I think in probably any high school, if you take any population of 300 kids to 500 kids for, boys, you can probably find a kid who can just kind of go out and run the quarter mile in under 40 seconds. And if you take maybe a similar population for girls, you can probably go out and find somebody who can probably run the quarter mile in under 60 seconds, right? So it's really not that scarce to find people who can run that fast, even if they're totally untrained. And the author said that, but how many people you can find who can just run a 60 4 times in a row, 60-second quarter? And the guy's, well, there are none, right? Because this is well before the 4-minute mile, and it's not like people were down to 4 flat at that point when that author was writing. And Lydiard said that for him was basically, and I'm paraphrasing, but that was his sort of epiphany, was that, okay, we need to develop the stamina. Like all of this focus on speed isn't the issue. And so that's where I think one of the first big moments, especially in terms of a moment that got sort of extended outward to the broader athletic audience, that, okay, we need to use endurance. And one of the words that Lydiard uses is stamina, though. And I'm going to come back to that later, because I think this endurance, slow, speed, fast, the goal is to be fast. And so like ultimately speed makes you better, and endurance is sort of this thing that you kind of check off. I think that dichotomy in and of itself is an example of a limiting concept. So when we look at this and we say, well, aerobic, what does that mean? Where does that really come from? Well, I think that when you look at the currently most popular conventional accepted, shall we say, norms of how to define this, I find my conclusion is that it's seems to be defined between 30 minutes to 90 minutes. So best 30 minutes to best 90-minute intensity. And, another way you can think about that, if you want to think about it from a runner perspective, you might say your 10,000 meter PR to your half marathon best. Or in cycling, you would say, well, your functional threshold power, or your lactate threshold 2. right? But then people will perseverate around, well, how fast is functional threshold power? And I think functional threshold power would sort of trend more towards, I know people a lot of times say 60 minutes, but I think a lot of times they're really ultimately testing something that's probably more representative of what somebody could do for 30 minutes. Because they say, well, ride 20 minutes to failure and take 95% of that. But I think if you've ever tried that, and I've tried it, and it's awful and totally useless, because then you go and you say, okay, let me put this into these tables and charts, and you try, okay, I should do workouts at this intensity, and you stick it to the wall in front of you in the basement in the winter when it's time to ride on the trainer indoors, and you're like, yep, this is not working. And then it just sort of sits there, and you look at it sometimes, you're like, yeah, I remember when I thought that this was going to really make the difference for me this winter, and I was going to be a new athlete in the spring. And then I think towards the other end, you sort of see this lactate threshold too. And, which is something that presumably is slower because it's associated with, more like maybe 90 minutes. And, some people suggesting that elite marathoners are running close to their lactate threshold. And I think the reality is when we look at this is kind of a mad scientist phenomena, which, and I say mad scientist with humor, but I think there's a large extent towards which these scientific paradigms of evaluation have taken over the concept of how we train. And, other people have talked about in their perspective, on this in their, books that they've written, like Steve Magnus talked, about how there's this, there's very much a disconnect oftentimes between, science and coaches, and this sort of resentment of, both groups think that training is sort of their domain and they're the ones who figure it out. And that, by sort of ceding the possibility of knowledge to these other groups, that we won't really, that, somehow they're losing face or they're losing value. So if we just think about this from like the pure science perspective, of like, well, training is something that should follow the process of experimentation. And if a training theory is valid, then we need some way to back that up. Or that if training is changing the body, then we need to identify the physiology and then we target the physiology. And this is stuff that really has driven the development of these sort of defined spectrums of training intensity. And, one example of this, which is, I think, one of the more recent attempts at doing this, which has gained a lot of traction then in popular training culture, or at least among people who, are maybe more serious intent about training, is this concept of maximum lactate steady state. And if you're familiar with this, you may have seen a graph that looks something like this, where there's 4 lines and, the sort of bottom 3 lines, the lactate initially goes up and then it's sort of level for the duration. And then there's a 4th line where the lactate makes its initial jump and then it just sort of continues to go up across. And then the conclusion is, well, that line, the highest line where it stayed steady the whole way, that is the maximum lactate steady state. And I think the extent to which that's true is somewhat limiting, because when you look at that other line of, well, hey, what's really going on here? I think that and by the other line, right, because now we're talking about 4 lines, right? So we need to keep track of this. So let's just focus on the top 2 lines. The highest intensity at which the lactate is steady, and then this next step at which the lactate wasn't steady, but it accumulated across the duration of the test. So I think if you're going to use the word steady and you're going to use lactate, then it is correct to say that that 3rd line, or the highest line at which the lactate is even, you would have to say that's steady lactate. That's technically correct. But is that really something that we can derive a training intensity from? Because, I think that obviously, if we're going to run shorter durations of harder efforts, then, there's going to be metabolic stability, which is what's sort of signified to us by that even line, okay? And if though you've done this stuff and you've worked out at this high intensity, which is ultimately what maximum lactate steady state does, is it points to something, around 10K intensity or whatever. And, because one argument is, well, the reason why the lactate is accumulating throughout the thing is because that's an absolute, all out effort, right? And then the question would be, what's happening to velocity? Is velocity actually declining? Because if velocity is declining in that final test, right, then that's unsustainable. But if somebody's velocity is stable, but the lactate is, continuing, well, then that suggests that they're not actually at their maximum state and that lactate has nothing to do with it. But whatever, we're sort of getting, outside of the significance, because neither of those intensities are valid values to be using, because I don't think they reflect what we're looking for. And if you don't believe that, think about your experiences working out, like this. If you're really trying to apply this scientific approach where you're, and it's not bad to apply a scientific approach, but if you're doing it without clear understanding, as is the case with anything you try to do, the less you understand what you're trying to do, the less effective it's going to be. You find that it's kind of like running with a bag on your head, and very much literally true is that you're reaching exhaustion, your breathing is an absolute mess, your body is murdering itself, it feels like, from the inside out. And maximum lactate steady state is just one example. And as I've tried to emphasize before, we try to look at this stuff on this podcast from a critical perspective, but in the manner that a historian would, of like looking at almost, in a sense, I guess, the historiographic approach to the development of ideas about training. What consensus have formed over time, and how have these allowed us to sort of distill out certain understandings. And I think for most of us, we don't sit down and look at this stuff on that kind of a scale. But if we do, I think we start to realize why it is that we actually have the paper bag on our head, because, as is the nature of a historical perspective, you're trying to ask questions about development, influence, and bias, shaping ideology over time. And training is ultimately a symbolic ideology. And it's a human, which is no surprise, because training is a human behavior, and all human behavior is ultimately, ideologically driven, through some sort of system of, meaning, whether that's substantive or not. Those meanings oftentimes are reduced to symbolic significance. So if we look at, and let's think about this on a timeline, what are some of the benchmarks in the development of these ideas about lactate threshold? So, I think there's probably got to be other research out there, but I think these are some of the major benchmarks. And I think, and this is from an article written by Inigo San Milan, What is Lactate, and a Lactate Threshold, that was published in November of last year. And I think that, he's done enough research in the area that I feel confident that, he is familiar with some of the significant benchmarks. And if he's pointing them out, they're probably worth thinking about. But if we just sort of think of these chronologically, in 1930, a thing called the Owl's Point is when one of the first instances of using lactate and looking at the increase in lactate as identifying some sort of a critical metabolic point. Then in 1964, this point is first labeled as anaerobic threshold. And the belief is because this is a tipping point where we go from having reached the limit of supply of O2 and of oxygen, and now we have to become anaerobic. In 1976, this is when anaerobic threshold is first defined as 4 millimoles. So it seems that in the 1970s is when we're starting to get these specific millimole values. But we're also seeing in 1979, the onset of blood lactate accumulation is defined as the point of +1 millimole in lactate concentration. So, and I've talked about in other episodes that your lactate will go along and it will be steady, and then it will, at some point, as you increase intensity, start to increase. And usually what people see is it goes up by 1. I think it can also go up by a little more, but generally the pattern is that if it goes up by 1 and then the intensity goes up again, it will not come back down. In 1981, you have onset of blood lactate accumulation, and you might see this in the literature or, referenced in general use as OBLA. So now we see this defined as 4 millimoles of blood lactate. So again, that 4 number. And if you've listened to content on this, you see a lot of people confidently just regurgitate these numbers. And I think that's because the historical perspective is not usually considered to be a necessary intellectual skill in thinking about training and coaching and endurance sports. and how we should approach those in terms of our best practice. In 1981, we also see maximum steady state as a term is defined as 2 millimoles. So now I think we're starting to see this idea that there's, clear conflict, right? Now, I would look at this conflict and I would say the conflict is really about what lactate threshold is, okay? Not that the conflict is about, where the two respective thresholds are. And I'm going to get to that a little bit more about how I think that really, I don't think there's ever been much of a, evidence-based assertion that there are these multiple thresholds. I think it's people arguing about what the threshold is. And we're seeing right within this timeline that people are arguing for very different intensities. And if you've done any training where you've used a lactate threshold, you probably know that 4 millimole is, pretty difficult. And, imagine trying to follow a training schedule over the long term, over, like with my example of 278 days when, I'm seeing a decay. And if you're listening to this just on the podcast, then you want to take a look at this, but you don't have time to check out the video on YouTube, you can go to our Instagram, and I posted this there as well. So then a couple other benchmarks. In 1983, lactate threshold is introduced as a term where we have blood lactate is defined as a nonlinear plus 1 millimole increase. So similar to that 1979 onset of blood lactate accumulation. Also in 1983, maximum steady state workload, blood lactate is nonlinear. And in 2003, sorry, we didn't finish that thought. And hold on. In 1983, maximum steady state workload, blood lactate is defined as 3 millimole. When you get to 3 millimole, if it's been a nonlinear increase, that's what we're looking at there. But again, I think the nonlinear thing is maybe sort of ambiguous, right? And I could be confusing that with other stuff, right? Because this stuff becomes so interchangeable about the language here. And some people might be steady at that, and that's where you could be steady at 3 millimole in that MLSS protocol. But if you're looking at it in terms of what's the point of and that's where onset of blood lactate accumulation, that should be defined as the point at which lactate starts to increase. And I don't really see how people get to 4 and not already have hit that, right? But you can see this just thinking about these instances, right? We start to become very confused. And then 2003, that's when we have the maximum lactate steady state come in. And we just talked about that, right? This idea of, well, what's the maximum millimole at which it can stay steady for a constant rate of work over a given interval of time? So how about some real world data? I think in the last episode, I talked about Stephen Levitt and Freakonomics and how, an economics perspective on this stuff is to say, well, we have all of this data from what people are actually doing, actually experiencing. Let's take a look at that. Now, I don't have access to everybody's in the world training data, but we go back to my example, right, of, my regression essentially. And, this is a scattered range of, 640s to 740s, and is generally trending towards slower. And might be a period, there's a period in the middle there where I have maybe a half a dozen sessions where I'm, getting down 655, 640s, and then it just goes back up. And, I think that we could argue, for me as an athlete, maybe I just suck lemons and I'm not really, making the effort and I'm not staying mentally tough. But I think training is behavioral. And, if we're not able to engage with it, then is it really effective? And I would suggest the answer is no, because what we're experiencing is something that's, sort of more sisyphistic. And even in this data, when the training is more frequent, right, or the density seems to be greater, it doesn't really break the trend, right? You might have a small period and where you're just sort of hovering. And the other thing too is those periods are just sort of, it's like in contrast to this other data. It's like, well, it was progressing there. Was it? Or was I just sort of forcing my way, down to these paces out of a sense of, well, maybe if I start running 650 pace, then this will feel easier, but eventually you just find that you get completely crushed by this, right? And that's why I say this intensity these high intensity definitions of lactate threshold are sisyphistic. And as a consequence, you'll see things like, Lionel Sanders and Sam Long being like, forget lactate. Lactate's totally useless. You can't use it. It's not reliable for anything, blah, blah, blah. And, I don't obviously communicate with people in that space of athletic training. But I think that it's certainly the case that essentially that we see that probably the abandonment is due to the fact that they're experiencing something, like the trend that I'm describing, right? Is you're trying to apply this supposed intensity and you're not really experiencing the progression. Now, I don't know if they're putting this data down in a spreadsheet so they can try to model it visually. I think as an athlete who does this stuff, you are engaged with it. So you can really just kind of tell if it doesn't seem to be working. And, when you're at a level of professionalism and you really need to progress, I think you're actually maybe more likely to say we need to abandon this. So lactate threshold, though, I think has to be then a point at which if you train below that intensity, you're seeing a very different result than if you train above that intensity. Okay, and here's an example of that. For 9 weeks this summer, in the beginning of July, I had actually pulled a muscle in my chest and shoulder, and I was concerned, can I even run fast enough to be training effectively? And so I went to the track and I did a lactate test. I jogged for 10 minutes. I ran what I thought was a steady but regular running effort, not a workout effort, for 10 minutes. And then I did 10 minutes of what I thought threshold was. And after the 10 minutes I thought was threshold, which was maybe 6:47 pace or so, I think, but actually, or 6:57, whatever, right? The point is nothing mind-boggling. I would say by my standards, my socially constructed standards of what training is, very conservative. And I did that, and it was like, wow, I'm at 5.2 millimoles. What the absolute hell is going on? And, but I was like, oh my goodness, I really do not know how hard I should be training. And I was like, well, it is also really uncomfortable to run that fast because my diaphragm has to expand so much that this pulled muscle is making this absolutely miserable. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to, I had already reached this, perspective that, well, lactate threshold is really the point at which the last sort of intensity you can reach before you start to see an accumulation of lactate. But I just hadn't applied that to my running in terms of testing it, because I just figured, well, I've been a runner for a long time. I'm not stupid. I know how that feels. And I guess I am pretty stupid because, I was training at a lactate intensity that was over. And that effort that I did on that track, that was what I was doing for all of those sessions, and I'd love to know what kind of lactate I was doing, in college and in instances when I feel like I've been training harder, because to me that felt like that was under control. And so this 9 weeks period, what I basically saw is I saw a progression from, maybe 8:24, 8:20 pace down to now 7:15 to 7:05 pace. And that's the velocity. And when you look at it in terms of watts from a stride pod, you see an even stronger, more evident trend. But this progression is very linear. Where when you see, with this sort of things being bad for that long 278-day period, you're really just recognizing these are all over the place. But here that it's also a very controlled trend. And again, you check this out on the Instagram or the YouTube video if you want to see this, for those of you listening on the podcast. And it occurs to me, right, as I looked at this data after this 9 weeks, that this is what's supposed to be happening. Yeah, maybe you're not always going to have that exact rate of progression. Otherwise, right, I'd be, running a 2-hour marathon, in 15 months. And obviously that's not there. But like you should see a strong linear progression when you're training aerobically as you get down to that aerobic intensity. But I think ironically, some of us will look at something like this and we're going to be like, well, that's pretty suspicious. I don't really trust that. And, we need to go to the interrogation room and be like, well, is this a scam? Is somebody screwing with us? Are we being, set up? Is this like a Pink Panther moment? But if you think about the data in a different way, I've got some, and this is also on the Instagram page, but, I've done a couple different, maybe like 8 or so different lactate step tests on the Wahoo Kicker, at least that I've, kept the data for. And I looked at those millimoles and, what's that progression look like? And I talked about this in, other episodes too. But if you look at it from the perspective of these sort of normal definitions for this like lower threshold and this higher threshold is recommending that I train at these wattages that are much, much greater than what I really should be doing. And that's the kind of approach that led to this sort of scattered, regressive training, right? Where I was going out and I was working hard. It doesn't look like I'm working hard because the paces don't meet the standard of cool workout paces, but I was actually generating a lot of lactate. And the actual intensity that I should be training at, what I've adjusted to, is well below that. So in some scales, I should have been working out at maybe, 220 to 280 watts could have been a lactate threshold zone. But according to the conventional paradigm, I should have been working out at 320 watts for LT1, and then I should have been working at 350 watts for LT2. And, every time I would be like, okay, I need to like actually, train seriously, it would fail. And for me, having been, as is the case for, I think, many of us, we can't always be at our, absolute fittest. And when I spent about 7 years coaching extracurriculars, at the school where I teach, that sort of led to a big general decline in my fitness. And so there's been, a process of trying to, get back to that. And, it's, in a general sense, I've stronger and fitter, and I've had some good, efforts. I've done 350 watts in a time trial for, 75 minutes, and I've been happy with that, but it hasn't been consistent. And it's like, I kind of get to a certain point and I'm just kind of stuck there. And so for me, this last 9 weeks, this progression is like a big shift. It's a big change in experience. So this brings up to the concept of, well, let's talk about the difference between the standard threshold versus which I'm arguing is the correct threshold. And if you look, training zones, how should I be training intensity, I think you can find as many as 8 different training zones. And, a lot, you can put these on a graph with, level of work on one axis and exertion, energy demand on the other axis. And then you can throw in a VT2, an LT2, and a VT1 and an LT1 on there. And I think you end up with these zones that are, you have, if you look at all 8, when I sort of look around and I say to how many different zones can I combine together, I end up with an 8-zone model, which is active recovery, aerobic capacity, and then you get to LT1, at least according to the model, tempo, sweet spot, and then you oftentimes see threshold defined as this, over-under zone, where like threshold is this exact point that's right in the middle, and then you're over LT2, but you're somehow still within threshold, and then you get into VO2 max, and then you get into anaerobic, and you get into neuromuscular. And when you look at these graphs, these graphics or graphs of these kinds of intensities, it's very compelling because it's usually very neat and it sort of looks well considered, and it's colorful and whatever. But I think this is a bunch of BS. Okay, this is my conclusion, and I say this as somebody whom, when I coached cross country, and we had 2017, we had the best performing cross country team in the history of the sport in the state, and That's just what happened. So I say this as somebody who had that experience, and I was, working with those athletes on the 7-zone model. So that would have been active recovery, aerobic capacity, tempo, threshold, VO2 max, anaerobic. But the reality is that I wasn't probably actually doing that. I was using those distinctions of zones to try to communicate with the athletes about, well, these are the different levels of exertion. But really, what I primarily tried to do was I tried to do easy aerobic training. I tried to do, aerobic steady training. And then when we did faster running, I always tried to keep the reps really short, and usually less than 45 seconds, because my feeling at the time, and I would still think that there's probably some general merit to this, but my philosophy at the time was, okay, if it's longer than 45 seconds, the legs are going to start to get tired. And so in the reality, I thought I was using this model, and the other thing too is we weren't using heart rate monitors, and we weren't using lactate testing. So it was all subjective. So, it was using the language of the zones to say, you know what, how you can feel this effort and it gets harder, right? Trying to talk to the kids and figure out how hard are they working. And, we weren't maybe actually applying that model. I think that's one of the other things that's tricky, like with the, top triathletes who are, jumping off the idea of using lactate almost as soon as they jump on it, because they're like, nope, I'm not seeing the performance jump. I know what I can do. I know what I've done in the past. This isn't adding any value. I'm going back to what I think works because, right, I'm trying to pursue this professional career in this domain. So if we start to strip this stuff down, well, how can we peel this back to something simpler? Well, I think the first thing that we can do is we can get rid of neuromuscular. And so then we can also get rid of sweet spot. And then we kind of have this 5-zone model, right? And this is also very common, I think, active recovery, aerobic capacity, and then there's this tempo zone in between VT1 and LT2, and then there's threshold, VO2 max, and anaerobic. And I think we can pull that back further. I misspoke. That would be a 6-zone model. The 5-zone model would just say active recovery, aerobic, and then threshold 1, and then tempo, and then you get to lactate threshold 2, and then you're in threshold, and you're in, and then you go up to VO2 max. Okay, and then I think a simpler model, which is what you see with polarized training, is this concept of 3 zones, where you have zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, and that's where you have the 80-20, right? Where you're saying you're spending 80% of your training is in zone 1, and then 15% of your training is zone 2 and zone 3, and then 5% is zone 2, and then people say 80-20 because it's 80% is really easy and 20% is really hard, and so everybody's like, okay, I need to go really hard 20% of the time. And that's just not correct. I mean, that 80-20 conclusion is really based on behavior. From Stephen Seiler's research of trying to do kind of a Stephen Levitt type thing. I don't know or have any evidence to suggest he was read Freakonomics and was like, wow, I should look at training like this. But he tried to look at real world data of athletes, and behaviorally that's what he saw. So from elite athletes. So maybe those elite athletes are still doing too much high intensity. Because there's also the study about the most successful women's Nordic skier of all time, who had her 5 years of dominance when she cut her intensity over the polarized zone 1 in half, and then increased her total volume of training and increased her time in zone 1 from 85% of her training time to 93% of her training time. And if we think about this, the best way I think to really try to make this into meaning is to try to think about, well, what's really happening to the body? And so this is how I conceptualize this. And I'm sure that there are, I know there are details and, specificities to understanding and, how these pathways and processes work. But in terms of conceptually, what do we really want to try to grasp to think about what's going on? So, the body is trying to generate energy to do work. And the way it does this efficiently, up until that LT1 point, and I'm not even going to call, that second ventilatory threshold. I'm not even going to call that LT2 because I don't think that exists. I think there's a point at which you transition from that steady breathing sort of, okay, I'm starting to notice my breathing in LT1 to sort of ragged breathing. So I think, yeah, there's, evidence for a second ventilatory threshold, but I don't think that necessarily means anything is happening. And I'll show you why and explain why I think that's the case. But so, right, through mitochondria and in the presence of oxygen, you can create energy, and this energy can come from sugars and lactate and fat, all of which, I guess basically can be converted into the pyruvate, and then through the mitochondria, right, you get energy out of that. And when you think about this, the mitochondria's utilization increases, across that zone 1 up to a point at which it's 100% engaged at VT1. And that's why the lactate starts to accumulate in the blood. And I understand, some of the vernacular or the linguistics around this is to say, well, the blood is being cleared into the lactate is being cleared into the blood. But I prefer to think of this as, lactate is energy, so it's being utilized or it's not. And, I know that there's this thing where, as you're sort of going harder and harder, the type 2 muscle fibers, which do more glycolysis and that has more lactate, et cetera, et cetera. But essentially, right, if the lactate is somewhere else, then it's not able to be used, right? And then when you slow down, well, now the lactate is going away. So obviously you have the capacity to use that, that energy. And as you move through that point and you go past that point, you hit that peak level of mitochondrial use, you can go harder and harder, but you can't use the mitochondria anymore. They have a maximum level of utilization. And if you think about things from the perspective of adaptive responses and, kind of an epigenetic thing of like, how do you get the genes to express themselves in certain ways? I don't think there's any good logical argument for why it would be the case that, well, when something is at 100% utilization, like you can't use something more than 100%. I know that in, culture, it's normal to say, well, I gave 110%. Well, you can't, right? You either have the maximum or you don't. So all the body is going to know is like, oh, wow, we're in a situation where we're using all the mitochondria. So it follows that you can work harder than this and get aerobic development. And obviously a lot of people have done that and do that today. But the way this is tracking against the lactate threshold curve is basically that, below lactate threshold, it looks like mitochondria can keep up with the influx of lactate and they're meeting energy demands. And working over lactate threshold is probably still maximally taxing the mitochondria. The amount of lactate increases because lactate is supplied based on mitochondrial capacity. But like training over lactate threshold only creates good training because it's also maxing out the mitochondria. It's not doing more beneficial. It's not doing anything that you didn't already do when you hit that threshold that people call LT1, and I'm suggesting is the threshold. And once you've peaked aerobically in training intensity or training work that you're doing, there's no point in going harder. What you want to do is accumulate more work at that state, because that's how you're going to increase the stimulus and the response, right? And we know that's true because people who train more and in general practice more tend to do much better. And so when we think about this concept of these 3 zones of polarized training, which is sort of considered to be this radically simple concept of how to train and whatnot, it's oftentimes suggested that, the lactate is steady in zone 1, it increases maybe arithmetically through zone 2, and then it starts increasing even more in zone 3. And I have a great graph of a lactate test I did with my brother against my lactate, where he is dead level at 0.7 millimole up until 320 watts, and then it shifts and it just goes up at a continuing rate all the way up until he stopped at like 8 millimoles or whatever. And I think that that's just evidence of the fact that this idea that there's this nuance to these lines is different. It's more of a curve. And I think if we look at the nature of the curve, it's exponential. And when I say people are randomly picking a point on there and declaring that to be LT2, if you think about an exponential function. Now, I don't have a degree in mathematics, so I apologize if I'm undercharacterizing this, but from one reference, this exponential curve, quote, in applied settings, exponential functions model a relationship in which a constant change in the independent variable gives the same proportional changes, that is, percentage increase or decrease in the dependent variable. And to me, the language in there that I focus on is saying that the change is constant. So even though it's not linear, it's constant. And so when you're looking at the curve and you're saying, okay, this thing is happening here, it's getting steeper there, I feel like that's not the right interpretation, because that's actually, the relationship isn't changing. The relationship is constant. The relationship changed when it went from linear to exponential. And that's the lactate threshold, and has to be literally the point at which lactate accumulation starts to occur. So I say that there actually is no second threshold. So if there's no second threshold, that means then there isn't a zone 2 and a zone 3, and that means that there's just maybe zone 2. And if we go a little further, I think that this, in our logic here, I think this matches history, where we first had anaerobic organisms and then we had aerobic organisms which evolved out of that. And so then I say, well, if we're training, then basically there's really one intensity. And this, I would say, is kind of the state at which we're challenging maximum mitochondrial capacity. And as we get to sort of the high end of that range, that's VT1 and LT2. That's how I would define that. And that's, at this high level of aerobic pressure, up to the point at which you start to accumulate, but, not going over that. And I would define this as stamina. I think that's what stamina is. And I think when, Lydiard athletes are training, and I think, at some point, one of my ambitions with this podcast is to try to do some research and try to identify what are the different individuals or training groups over time that have basically independently arrived at this conclusion and have sort of taught themselves or taught others in their, training cohort how to identify this, using different language, like my dad, saying that he tried to feel like he was making deposits and not withdrawals. To me, I think that's a distinction. When Gustav Eden says that, threshold, over threshold, hands on knees, under threshold, standing upright normally. And then I think, around this stamina, right, we have an endurance and we have speed. And so sort of when we're kind of dropping below that intensity, we're challenging that maximum mitochondrial capacity. We're sort of maybe more endurance-like. And then we go over that, maybe we're pushing into things that are more sort of akin to speed. And that, like fitness, the fitness is coming from stamina. Stamina is fitness. That threshold development, that's fitness. And like your speed can only function up over your stamina to so much of a degree, especially when you're talking about stuff that's effective. And so when we look at, again, think about my progression over that 9-week period, that last 9 weeks, that's a product of training in stamina. That was the change that I made. And I think this is validated through the data that, I used with lactate threshold testing too, because the other question is the pace improving, but I'm just sort of pushing back up towards working out at higher and higher, millimoles, because I've already demonstrated a tolerance, not necessarily in a good way, but a tolerance and just sort of like I will tolerate it, mentally, a tolerance to do workouts at 5 to 6 millimoles and be like, oh yeah, that was a good threshold workout, right? Whatever that means. But in the test I did at the beginning of July at 285 watts or 838 pace, was my first step. And then I did 315 watts, or 742 pace was my second step. And that was like 1.8 millimole. My first step was like 0.8. And then my third step was, 345 watts or 657 pace. And like I said, that was over 5 millimoles. And so then just approximately a month later, on August 8th, I did a step test again. I did 294 watts, and each of these steps is about 9 to 11 minutes, and that was 836 pace, and there my lactate was 1, and then I did 306 watts for about 8-minute pace, and there my lactate was like 1.1, and then I did 333 watts or 728 pace, and there my lactate was like 1.8. And then I did about 367 watts, and there my 6:44 pace, and there my lactate was 4.2, I think. And what's really meaningful about that is that's a significant change because, whereas before I couldn't even get up, I wasn't even getting up to 600 watts, excuse me, too many numbers, right? Getting up to 644, I capped out at 657. So at 657 pace, right, was 345 watts. And so we can compare. We can say, well, that was 5.2. And then if we look at what was the lactate at this point in the test, well, now it was like 3.5 or closer to 3, right? So that's a significant change. And that's what we want to see. We want to see less lactate at different intensities because, yeah, you're going to race over lactate threshold, right? But the point is, how do you train to bring that down so that when you go to race and you're working over lactate threshold, you have success with that? Because, my data is showing that, training at those higher intensities isn't doing diddly squat. And, when you compare these together and you look at these two graphs side by side, it's a noticeable shift in the curve. And I haven't retested. I did a gravel race, last weekend when it would have been the 8th or the 9th of September, but I'm going to try to, I'm obviously not going to do a lactate test after doing a race when my legs are totally trashed. So when we compare these trends, we're looking at a totally different process of training and then a process of response, and looking at a progression over 60 days. I mean, the fact that you're progressing at all when the original exemplar is a non-progression. But I think there are people who do get a progression going for themselves training at these higher intensities. And I would ask you to, question or reflect on, how good is your progression? How strong is your progression? Is your progression better than mine? And I think one of the obvious criticisms, which I want to acknowledge because I also think is really interesting, is you could say, well, is what's going on here that you're having a drop back down to that same intensity? But as I just tried to articulate, well, no, now we're actually getting to where we're running at paces and we're producing less lactate. Whereas at these other paces, I was just never improving that lactate number. So I was getting myself to run faster, but I was just producing more lactate. So here I backed off, I started slower, and then I've worked back down, and by training at the lactate, limits. And there have been certainly runs where I've gone out and I've run, harder, but I've always been, by mistake. I'm always trying to find that intensity. That's the right balance. And there was an instance where I did 6 by 2,000 meters at, about, average 7:07 pace on the road. And, the last 3 reps were at 650 watts. And, I knew I was going too fast, but I'm not a elite athlete. Part of it is when I feel good and I'm, feeling myself, I'm going to let myself, run a little bit, let myself ride a little bit. What I'm trying to do is not just sort of, I have those experiences actually more frequently, now that I've backed off, and it's more rewarding because I'm doing that and I'm progressing, so even though I'm not running faster, it's like, well, okay, now I'm floating. And I was running with Caleb McVeigh and I said, I know that I'm probably going too fast, but this is, what I like, this is what it's all about for me. And so, you're looking at this, you're thinking about how am I picking the right session to do, right? And so, I'm finding and I'm suggesting that, the solution is not to do, just run at steady state. Okay, I got to run at lactate threshold. And I don't think that's beneficial. And especially because if you just run at lactate threshold right on that line, you're probably going to end up drifting over. A, the lactate will go up, and then B, you're going to move into, using fatigued systems more, which then leads to more fatigue subsequently, which then limits training. But a lot of people think of this stuff as this dead space in training of you just go out and fill all these time and these hours and these miles that are sort of aerobic, but it's not really defined. It's just go out and run 8 miles. And when I ran in college, there was no discussion about what would happen on the days that weren't workouts. We just sort of went out and ran. And I think that was a huge lost opportunity because that was the majority of the time that we spent, training, really. And it was totally directionless and formless. And I think people are going out doing totally different things. And I suggest, an opportunity cost perspective, that there's a third option here. And I think the third option is to, do your run where you're breaking it into intervals. Not in the sense you go to a track, trash yourself, recover, trash yourself, recover, trash yourself. But, just spend, 5 minutes, maybe 4 minutes at lactate threshold, then do, a couple minutes where you're going very easy. And so now, right, you're going to get time at that. You're going to increase that stimulus. And I would suggest that I don't think that the stimulus turns off. Or it's like, well, if I do 8 times 5 minutes, I'm only getting 40 minutes. Why don't I just do 40 minutes? That's probably better. I don't think that's true. I think that, the stimulus, maybe tapers or wanes. Because if the stimulus turned off, then the only time you would get fitness development is when you literally were in the act of exercising. And that's obviously not true. So when you use intervals and you have longer recovery, you're actually getting more value out of your 40 minutes of LT. So think about that. There's a big idea that I'm confident very few of us have ever really considered, right? Because we say the work interval is productive, and usually the norm is to get more benefit, you need to decrease the rest. Well, if the rest is active and you're moving and and easily but aerobically, you can actually get more work done because you can spread that out. You could do 5 minutes LT, 5 minutes easy, right? And do that 8 times. Well, that would be 80 minutes. That would be twice as much. You're increasing the stimulus without doing more work. And that's probably, you could do 8 times 5 minutes LT, 5 minutes easy, and that'd probably be more beneficial, and definitely more beneficial and less fatiguing than just doing 65 minutes at just continuously at LT. And that's how we should be thinking about training strategically, because, goals are important. And, part of my thought process on this, I think the book Easy Interval Method and I'll get to this in a second, the book Easy Interval Method, I think really offers some further evidence on this. And I'm trying to be conscientious about pointing out sources, because, evidence is the basis of argument here. And I'm definitely making a pitch for something that I think goes against the grain. But I think I look at 4 goals. I want to achieve stimulus. I want to achieve volume. I want to limit fatigue, and I want to maintain quality of movement. Okay. Everybody knows what it's like to feel like you're falling apart and start staggering. It's not enjoyable. That's a sign of fatigue. And when you have a great race, your movement you're powerful the whole way, right? So trying to always run with good movement is important. I don't know if that's a marginal gain or not, right? But, I think a marginal gain is great when we're looking at, at alternative training strategy that is is a regression, right? So marginal gains are pretty good when the opportunity cost is regressive. So Klaus Luck, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but published this book in 2006, Easy Interval Training. And I think it's one of the more interesting, thought-provoking books I've read about training. And I've, an example of his approach to this, which, I think to me really adds a lot of weight to the idea of, you're still getting training benefit during the recovery. The recovery isn't somehow less beneficial. And, one of the themes of the book is, hey, you don't have to train as much. And, I'm always suspicious of that because, I'm like, that sounds cheap. And so I kind of looked at it. What in the book, he focuses on look, this is the essential stuff. So then you just say, okay, what does that actually look like? So he suggests, if you take his sort of idea of what is a good training day, he says do 6 by 1,000. And if you look at the schedule, it says 6 by 1,000. You're like, wow, 6 by 1,000, that's not much. That's not that much running. How can I get better off of doing that? Well, then you read and you break it down, and it would be 15 to 20 minutes warming up, 8 by 30 meter strides. And then for 10.8K, you're basically alternating between 1,000 meters at threshold and then 800 meters easy running. And of course, if you do these thousands at this so-called LT2, it doesn't work. And he says, what's interesting in the book, which reflects this confusion, is he says that, a lot of times lactate threshold, he's saying is, well, it's like 10K pace. But then he'll say I did a lot of my 1,000 slower than marathon pace. So I think, and to me, well, that's what's important. Not this hey, put this is the physiological information to put in here, kind of we're holding you at gunpoint. This is what you need to tell people. because he's saying that you can calculate your thousands pace or determine your thousands pace off of a test of 10,000 meters racing, about 30 minutes, which is, to me, is very much conversant to the maximum lactate steady state concept. And that concept, right, was sort of put out there in 2003, and the first edition of this book was published in 2006. So that can't be coincidence. But then he's saying, well, the reality is I would do this stuff at slower than marathon pace a lot of the time, which is totally different from that maximum lactate steady state. So, and that's where I say, what is the actual data? Let's look at the historical evidence. What are the actual practices? But let's look at not just take those practices and interpret them against a physiological curve, but say, how do they actually describe what they're doing and what parts of their training were actually effective versus what are the stuff they did just because they felt that they had to. And so after that 10.8 kilometers, 3 by 100 meter strides, 15 to 20 minutes cooling down. So that's 83 to 93 minutes, not counting the strides. So how does that compare to our goals? Well, the stimulus targets stamina for about an hour. The stimulus doesn't turn off during the recovery jogs, right? So you're getting that continuous stimulus. If you're a stronger runner, that's going to be an 11 to 14 mile training session. That's a big, substantial run. That's on, pace for a 70 mile to 95 mile week or whatever. You've got recovery intervals in there, which are going to limit your fatigue accumulation. So that makes training more sustainable. And, I think that interval format versus steady state format also ensures quality of movement. I mean, most of the interval training I did, especially as a younger athlete, and what, you learn from that is actually that's when you have the worst movement because you're totally failed. And, I think that's something Lydiard talks about in his books too, is that, apart from the fact that they couldn't control form, they couldn't peak on the day, they couldn't be ready. He said they couldn't plan training because you would just feel so inconsistent from day to day. And that when they pulled back and started training aerobically, then they could actually have a training strategy because they knew every day they'd be able to show up and do this. And so then example of some of the workouts that, I've done, and, one of the things that I'm, now as I'm saying, Looney Tunes thinking more and more about, increasing my recovery time. But to be honest, the part of it for me is, I'm doing a lot of my training around my work schedule. During the work year, I'm trying to run as a teacher, trying to run at 5:30 in the morning, and you got a limited amount of time, and I don't, I want to, do exercise that I find enjoyable and productive within that time. But I've, also now incorporating, slower stuff, and I'm interested to see how that affects my my progression trend. So 3 examples, would be 12 by 800, 100 meter jog, 5 to 6 by 2,000 meter with a 145 jog, 16 by 600 with 30-second jog. Those are primarily what I rotated through in doing this. And I think, again, the goals, all of those intervals are targeting that stamina or LT intensity. So stimulus targets stamina for about an hour, doesn't turn off during the recovery jogs. Remember this. Okay, so it's okay to take, longer recovery. I think if you're pulling down a little bit below LT, then you can take the shorter jogs. And I think sometimes you do the shorter jogs if you want more of a kind of an endurance challenge to your stamina work. And if you have longer jogs, I think you can go about a little bit quicker while still staying in under lactate threshold because you're not accumulating because the reps are short enough. Volume for me is, 8 miles for a stronger runner. Maybe you get up to 11 miles. Recovery is limiting the fatigue accumulation, and quality of movement is still there. And when you look at this in terms of power using StridePod, you see an even stronger trend of improvement over that 9 weeks. I've, improved from working out at about 300 to 309 watts to now I'm just going out there and I'm just sort of drifting at 345 watts. And like I said, it's been a month since my last test, so I need to verify that, the data. But I think it's holding with the trend, and you can see this data on Instagram. I know I keep repeating that, but I want people listening on the podcast to know it's there if they want the visual. And then even my recovery watts I thought was interesting because I also took a look at this data, and the watts I run in the recovery has also gone up. So I think that's reflecting, that overall relationship. And if you say, well, what can you control for? So if you look at heart rate scaled, from my resting heart rate, which, maybe is like 40, 42, something like that, up to max running heart rate, I'll ever get up to is 212. There's been a slight trend in increase in heart rate. And that could be from a couple different things. I don't think that using heart rate as a laser precision training thing is useful. I think that people lean into heart rate way too much. And maybe a part of that is the maximum aerobic function method from Phil Maffetone, and, going back to like Mark Allen and, the heart rate monitor. And maybe there's some history of popularization of that, especially in triathlon training. Whereas runners, I think are more sort of ambiguous about it. And cyclists are, more inclined to look at the power meter. But like, the heart rate, like whatever, like there's so many things that like your heart rate will go up as a result of so many different factors that I just don't think you can really rely on it. And my hypothesis here is that, a lot of the training sessions in the last couple of weeks, the weather's been a lot worse. There was a period in this data where my heart rate was like started being, under 150 and, it started workouts. And well, that was when it was like 58 degrees out and low humidity and a little breezy in the morning when I was, in Maine for a little while. And then, come back to central southern New Hampshire. And especially the last 2 weeks, it's been awful weather. And, the heart rate's a little bit higher. I mean, I think that's totally consistent with that. And you can see that one workout where I talked about going a little crazy is actually the anomaly, where I had average heart rate of 173. And I checked the lactate and I was like, oh man, I kind of screwed that up. Right. But we're not perfect, right? We're looking for progression in methodology. And I think it, shows it's hard to break these habits. A lot of us have been taught our whole athletic life to like respond to certain cues. And by the way, for those of you waiting for part 2 of that Who's On First podcast to talk more about using cues to identify threshold, that is still forthcoming. Fitness is fitness though. Okay. These workout models, I know I'm using running as a reference point because that's where my data is for this stuff. Like a lot of the riding I do is on a gravel bike and I don't have a power meter on it. So I don't really have good data for that for comparison. And heart rate stuff on a bike is even more totally useless because when you're riding outside, it's just all over the place as the terrain varies. But these workout models, you could apply these to any endurance sport. And especially if you focus on the principle, I think a lot of people say, well, is this the magic workout? Is that the magic workout? It's no, because it's about the goals, right? Are you achieving the goals? Do you understand how to achieve them? But a lot of people want to be able to get good training without understanding their training. And, this pace progression, I mean, I think to remember the pace progression that I experienced, my running velocity progression over the last 9 weeks, that's training done at true lactate threshold, which I'm calling maximum mitochondrial capacity or, the onset of blood lactate accumulation, right? OBL, OBLA. And, that would be in that, I think, the 1979 definition. And I'd emphasize that I've never worked out this slowly for running, in over 20 years. I've never gone out and said, I'm going to do a workout with periods of work and periods of recovery and worked out this slow. But I've also probably never experienced this kind of a progression. It raises a really interesting question because physically I'm much stronger, than I've ever been in terms of my max strength. I'm also a little bit heavier, which sort of limits some of the responsiveness from that. But like, it is an adjustment mentally to sort of shift away from this constructed notion of how hard we should work. And when I think about this, like I think I did like 262 total repetitions over this 9 weeks, 262 repetitions because I did 28 workouts and it was less than 60 days, I think, and the velocity progresses, and the watts progress, and it also happens in the recovery. And there were, several, stretches where I might do 2, 3, or at one point I did 4 workouts consecutively. And after At one point, I think I did 5 actually. And, at that point, on the 6th day, I was like, yeah, okay, I'm a little tired, right? But, that's totally different, right? I tried doing 5 workouts in a row, of 12 and they were all 12 by 800. Ask yourself if you wanted to accumulate, that many repeat 800s, that how long would that take you, right? How long would it take you to do that, right? That's whatever is that 62, or is that 74, right? 74, whatever. It's hard to podcast and do math at the same time. But when you do this, look at that. How long would it take you to accumulate that many 800s doing a conventional workout model? You may be going to do 6. You may be going to do it once a week, maybe twice a week. You're looking at a significant amount of time. So what we're seeing is an increase in the density of training. And what we're seeing is happening is when you have an increase in volume plus frequency, you have an increase in progression. And when you have a decrease in volume plus a decrease in frequency, you have what I would just say is a null stimulus. And I think that's reflected by the regression. So let's think about some conclusions from this. What can we really understand? Well, I think first of all, training is behavioral, social, and cultural. We're sensitive to the symbolic meanings of training, that we're going to interpret the value of what we do based on the socially constructed significance of different kinds of workouts. And it's hard to change what we're doing because it's hard to separate from those systems of meaning. Hard workouts have value as like ritual acts, and these rituals, they signify transformation. And this is oftentimes more socially valued than real but non-visible transformation training, like what I've tried to sort of give light to, right? Seeing is believing. I've tried to show that here and articulate that to the best of my ability. Density, volume plus frequency equals improvement. Athletes need to see their training is not working in order to want to train, right? Symbolic value is ultimately not good enough. You're going to, at some point, most of us are going to say, yeah, I'm going to lose interest. And that's the difference between finding something that you're passionate about and being able to do it throughout your life versus having it, be a phase. Like people like, one time I wanted to run a marathon, so I did, and then I never ran again. And, understanding that adaptation requires a change in the sense of environment. Marine iguanas on the Galapagos Islands will shrink their skeletons to save energy during El Nino. Think about that scale of adaptation. That's because the environment is different. Adaptation is environmentally driven, right? And that's not an evolutionary scale, right? Iguanas evolved to become these aquatic animals that can swim in the ocean and on the islands there, and hold their breath for 15-20 minutes, eat the algae that grows on the rocks in the bottom of the seafloor. That's evolution. Adaptation, adaptations are things, responses to the environment within an organism's lifetime, and that's what training is. You need to create those conditions, right? And when you have higher density of training, what a surprise that now we see adaptation starts to happen. And we know that adaptation is physiological, and it's not just a psychological effect of, okay, I start slow and then I just get back up to the same pace again, because now we have this improvement, using the lactate data as a reference point. So it's the immersion in the adaptive environment that requires a lot of motivation, okay? Because to stay immersed in that and create that continual effect, that's hard. And when training is being done as intensively as a lot of these sort of mad scientist models, are trying to get us to do, it's not going to work. And what we want to see is we need to see the improvement if we want to sustain that immersion. And when we look at this from the perspective of the aerobic calculator, which is what I have shown, like the one calculator over that longer period, shows no progress. And so what a surprise that it gets boring and uninteresting. Nothing is happening. But when you can have controlled progression, well, now it's interesting, right? And when you can see that occurring, that's going to be engaging. And so if you build that model for yourself, put that in a spreadsheet, so that you can convert it into a graph and you can track that trend, now you have something that you're going to want to engage with. So when we think about conclusions here, if you track your stamina, your LT workouts, then, they should be frequent enough. If you have the right intensity, you'll be able to do them frequently enough I think 3 to 5 times a week is a reasonable goal. You'll start to see a trend in 3 to 4 weeks. And then you use this data to be responsive. Okay, so now you can actually train responsibly. And, with athletes I coach, this is really what, I want to work towards, is that the highest level of coaching is to be able to not give people the schedule and be like, how'd the workout go? It was a tough one. Oh, good, you stuck through it. Great. Well, you got another workout later. Or, yep, here's the schedule. It's to be able to take the data and say, okay, I see what's happening. Now I can use this information to figure out what intensity is right. Let's make the changes. Let's make the adjustment. And it's empowering because the coach and the athlete can both look at the data and recognize the trend. And then, the athlete can talk about what they're feeling, and then the coach uses their knowledge to help, interpret and guide, the direction on that. And then you're collaborating, and collaboration is always more fun than autocracy. So my guideline would be, if the trend is not showing improvement, A, increase frequency of training. B, increase volume per session of training. C, increase recovery between intervals in training. If the trend is not showing improvement, but you're experiencing fatigue, well, then decrease density of training. Check that your lactate levels are appropriate in your workouts, and then also check that you've correctly identified the value at which lactate accumulates. A lot of people overestimate that. So testing that and finding that out correctly, ascertaining what that is really important, because that's how you're going to periodically check. And then if you do that, you should see, that progression change should occur, and again, my 9 weeks is the example of that. And one thing to be leery of, and I think this is also where the Aerobic Calculator will tell you this is happening. So if you have a progression, so if my velocity just plateaus, so that would be the possibility that at some point I start cascading. And I'm just kind of coining this term here today, but I think cascading happens as a result of feeling good. And when we feeling good, training causes us to then want to drift back into higher and non-productive intensities again. Well, the calculator will show you that plateau, and it might take a little while, right, to see that happen. But you'll realize that your velocity isn't progressing, but I feel like you're working harder. And then if you go to the lactate again, and you say, oh yeah, I'm going over. I overestimated my progress here. And I think this is where learning to feel the threshold is so important. And that's why I've talked about on some other episodes, and going to continue exploring that on other episodes. We have to learn the lactate intensity, and then we're periodically verifying with the lactate test. And if you train for feel and you control using the lactate test, the power will rise naturally as your fitness improves. That's just going to be what happens. And using Aerobic Calculator to monitor for progression, right? If you're willing to do this, it's very simple, and it's fun. Frankly, when things are going well, it's fun to look at yourself improving and follow that. And it's, increases, I think, motivation, because it's like, oh, I can't wait to get another data point. I want to do another one of these so I can get another data point. Whereas people dreading and like, how can I force myself through the next training session? And I think this is better than waiting for the next training result. But ultimately, all training has to be done one day at a time. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Stay tuned for a forthcoming episode on cueing, and probably some other episodes going further into particular nuances of applying this approach, including in particular, how do you make a distinction between endurance and lactate threshold training. You can check us out on our Instagram at BlackCatsRun. Let us know if you have any other topics you'd like us to discuss. We love the inspiration. We'll catch you next time.